love to welcome everyone this morning to our forum topic, how to help kids cope with climate change. We're going to be hearing from my friend, Dr. Charlie Orsak, who is a retired child psychologist and a volunteer with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and Citizens Climate Lobby. He loves living in the North Woods, and his presentation this morning is going to highlight how children, like that cute little guy, are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and how to talk with kids about climate change and build their resilience, as well as practical steps families can take together. So thank you all so much for joining online, as well as everyone here in the room. And Charlie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. When's the hard stop for Q&A?
Well, we'll end formally at 10:20.
So, okay, great. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Brett, it's...
Oh, no worries. I think you have to click here.
Okay. So, I really appreciate you inviting me here today. This is my calling, as I like to think about it. When I retired as a retired from being a child psychologist, I fell into this idea that we really need to focus on children and how we can help kids cope with climate change. And so thank you for inviting me to your home. This is you, the choir. I really feel like I'm preaching to the choir this morning, which I love preaching to the choir. It saves a lot of time, frankly, trying to convince, I speak other places where I have to spend some time talking about the climate change is real, it's serious, and it's happening now, and we need to do something. I think everybody in this room gets that. I'd also like to point out that not only are you the choir, but you're the leading choir. I have a collection of faith statements from various denominations and religions about climate change. And if you'll notice the date on this statement, it's 2007, 16 years ago. You beat the Pope. This is before Laudato Si. And I just highlighted this part of the statement. This is 2007. We declare by this statement of conscience that we will not acquiesce to the ongoing degradation and destruction of life that human activities are leaving to our children and grandchildren. So this speaks to me. So what are we going to do today? Well, first, I want to talk about the importance of values. Climate change is both a scientific and a moral issue. And part of the moral issue is we are all in this together. Some of us have more power than others, though. We have to recognize that. We'll talk a bit about what the science says about climate change, in particular, the effects that it has on children. Then we'll move into talking about how to talk with kids, how to help them cope, some ideas for action, and then I'll take some questions and we can have a discussion. I'd like to leave some time to that. So why is it important to talk about this? Well, number one, in my mind, is we love our children. I'm a parent, I'm a citizen, I'm a member of the First United Methodist. I'm an outdoorsman. I spent lots of time paddling in the North Woods, but mostly it came down actually thinking about this. The thing I think about the most is my daughter, who's 27. And if we don't act, what will the world look like? Well, we know that it's going to be less secure, less healthy, and less prosperous for our kids. And we also talk a lot about how the people that are the most vulnerable are the least responsible for climate change. We often think of, say, people in Bangladesh, but think about it for a second. Who's the least responsible for climate change? Right there. And where's the burden going to fall the heaviest? On children. And if you look at the research and the surveys, kids know about this. They have a lot of negative feelings. High percentages of kids are quite worried about this. They have, but if you poll them, they actually know more, they have a higher interest, and they have a higher level of acceptance. There's not much denial in younger generations. So, a little bit about the intersection of faith and science. Faith and science, in my view, and I have to credit Katharine Hayhoe, who I would recommend people, if you don't know about her, look at some of her videos. She's an evangelical climate scientist from Texas, and she's very eloquent on this point. But her point is that faith and science are complementary, not separate or in opposition. And science is a way to reveal the workings of creation. That's how we discover what's going on. Science measures CO2 levels, that figures out the cooling in the troposphere versus the stratosphere, et cetera. So it tells us what happens, and it hopefully leads us to something we can do about this. But it doesn't tell us what the right thing is to do, what the just thing is to do, or what the fair thing is to do. That's not a question for science, and scientists will tell you that that's not their wheelhouse. Now, I'm not suggesting that faith is the only way that somebody can discern right from wrong and can be just and fair. It's just on a personal level that informs my thinking in that area, but it's not the only way to think about it. So what does science say? The climate change is real, we're causing it, it's serious. We're already seeing the effects and we need to do something now. The science at the current moment says that it's not too late to make problems more manageable or to prevent the worst effects of climate change. And actually, if I had to choose, given the time constraints we have today, I took out slides about climate change. I think people know about that. But I thought, what's the one statistic I would show somebody if I had just like, show me one statistic, and it'd be this. If you survey climate scientists, 97% say that we are the primary contributors to climate change, and so we can do something about it. If I think about it, if I had a health concern and I went on the internet and it said that 97% of cardiologists would recommend this, that sway me. That's a pretty good argument. So let's talk specifically now about kids. So children, I also put an aside in, I'm also a retired registered nurse. So I was interested in, so what is it about kids that might make them particularly vulnerable or more vulnerable than, say, myself, to the effects of climate change? Well, two things. Children have immature physiologies. For example, their immune system isn't fully developed. And second, they're dependent on adults. So they can't act for themselves. So they are more vulnerable by virtue of their biology and their position in society. Now, if you look at diseases in general, say infectious diseases across the world, if you look at where the disease, what we call disease burden, who suffers the most from a particular infectious disease, by and large, it's kids under 5. If you look at gastrointestinal infections, tuberculosis, most of the disease burden falls on younger kids. And some specific physiological notes about this. Children are more sensitive to heat stress than adults. They don't have the same capability of regulating their body temperatures as we have. And we know that heat, of all the weather-related deaths, heat is #1 cause of the most deaths. And so kids are more, it'd be harder for a kid to live in Phoenix than it would be for me to regulate their body temperature. And we also know that excessive heat affects prenatal development, possibly. This isn't a settled fact, but low birth weight and premature birth is related to heat. So some other examples. Kids are more affected by poor air quality. So we all will, and one of the things we'll remember for this summer was what? The smoke. And so the rates of asthma are highest in kids, higher than adults. Some kids outgrow, in quotes, asthma. But so the poor air quality heat, and also we're noting another thing that's going to affect children is we're noting that the ranges for infectious diseases that we used to consider, say, tropical, or are now working their way north. In our area, you'll notice the West Nile virus and Lyme disease. I haven't lived here my whole life, but I've lived here nearly 30 years. And I can remember when they started talking about West Nile virus. You know, we were all scared of dead crows for a while there. You know, don't go near, crows carry this disease. And Lyme disease, when I worked for the Outward Bound schools up here for a time, and we didn't worry about deer ticks. We didn't worry about Lyme disease, but now they do. And so those are examples. And again, the burden will fall on children. I'm a psychologist, and we also know that children are more psychologically vulnerable. They're not just physiologically vulnerable, they're psychologically vulnerable. And in two ways. One is post-traumatic stress disorder related to extreme weather events. So if you think of Katrina and the hurricanes in Florida, fires, so kids can be affected by these particular extreme events that can lead to traumatic stress syndrome. But also, and in my mind, the biggest issue with psychological vulnerability is chronic stress. There's actually a term called solastalgia, which is grief over the loss of your home or your environment. And there's this part of climate change that makes it so insidious psychologically is it's everywhere, and it's out of your control. And it's coming, but you don't know how bad it's going to be. So we know that can lead to chronic anxiety and depression, and that can contribute to other stress. Kids have lots of stress in their life. The last thing they need is one more thing, right? When you're a teenager, when I was a teenager, I mean, I had enough questions about the future, what I was going to do, what was going to happen, let alone a bunch of adults telling me, oh, by the way, we may spoil the world for you in the future. So that chronic anxiety and depression, the most insidious thing that does is it just interferes with normal cognitive, social, and emotional development. So what can we do? And thanks to my artist friend Erica for her illustration. Well, we always talk about building resilient infrastructure. We have a committee in Duluth that's all about, you know, making Duluth a resilient place in regards to climate change. Well, here's our infrastructure as far as I'm concerned. This is the infrastructure we need to build resilience into, is our kids. And it's the same, it's not reactive, it needs to be proactive. So let's talk a little bit about, we know a lot about resilience, frankly, kids. The Search Institute in Minneapolis is a leading organization in terms of talking about resilience. And so we're going to move from vulnerability now to resilience, the positive side of the coin. So resilient kids in general are just better equipped to cope with stress at any time. I consider building resilience in kids the fire suppression system. You don't call up the plumber and say, I have a fire in my building, can you come install my sprinkler system for me? It's too late, it needs to be installed before the crisis. And so that's what we do with resilience with kids. Now, in the simplest terms, I want you to think in terms of assets. We all have assets, and kids have assets. Those positive things that help them survive, adapt, think, motivate, etc. And there's a list. There's over 40 developmental assets that you can look at. But the basic take-home message is this. If you look at the list of assets, the more you have, the better off you do. And in fact, I used to work right across the street. That's where I ended my career at Northwoods. And I literally, when I did evaluations for them, and I would literally sit down with a legal pad and write down what a particular kid's vulnerabilities were. And then on the other side, what are their assets? And I always feel, part of it was for my own, you know, trying to stay positive about kids, and the kids are amazing. They're amazingly resilient. And it wasn't hard, but every time the right side of the column would be longer than the left, and I'd always go, that's good, we're good here. We got more on the right than we have on the left. And so what are those particular assets that I think are important to build resiliency, and how, and in the same way, what's going to help kids cope with this crisis of climate change? And so values, and we'll talk about the specific values, are definitely a developmental asset. Kids that have certain values and adults that have certain values do better when things are stressful. And so let's give some examples. Integrity, honesty, responsibility, service, and love of nature. Those are just some of the values that I think we need to instill. If we instill in kids, they're going to be better off, and we're going to be better off in the way that they adapt to this climate change crisis. So let's talk a bit about how do you do this? How do you build resilience in kids? And so there's two things that I want to focus on today. Problem solving and communication skills. Those are on the list of developmental assets. If we help our kids develop these, they're going to be better off, and they're going to be better at, they're going to be more resilient and more adaptable. Self-efficacy and self-regulation are two other very important assets. Particularly, I'll talk more about the self-efficacy asset. We know that assets are not all internal. We have to take stock and inventory of the child's external assets. And we know that supportive relationships and service to others are very, very important. When I was working with kids, the question I would ask them is, tell me, do you like school? You can imagine what I heard. And I'd say, do you like your teacher? And I'd hear various things. Then I'd say, this is for little kids. I said, does your teacher like you? And if the kid said no, I knew that we did not have this asset. That kid feels like they don't belong. So feeling like this sense of belonging, this feeling of being surrounded by supportive help, supportive others, and service to others. Again, back to Northwoods. We used to do surveys when kids would finish their residential treatment or the other treatment. We'd do a survey about what they liked the most, not what they thought helped them, just what they liked the most. Well, we had a camp for kids. Every summer, rented a camp. They went to camp for a week. Horseback riding, shooting BB guns, and that won every year, of course. We hoped it won every year. But surprisingly, often second on the list was service to others. That feeling, again, it gets back to this feeling of belonging. So you take kids that don't feel like they belong anywhere, they've been shuffled around, and then they finally meet somebody that says, I'm glad you came to my house and helped me. Even the toughest kids would admit that felt pretty good. So that's the importance of places like this, where kids feel like they're loved and they're cared for and they belong. It's very important. And then engagement with positive peers, school, and with nature. School engagement's an incredibly important thing in resilience and kids' development. So let's talk about this. So here's our project. It's to help kids learn how to solve problems. Now we know that there's a framework of this that I've adapted from the researchers Folkman and Lazarus. And they basically identified 3 different ways to solving problems. The first one is emotional focus. You take an emotional focus, and the focus of this problem solving is to help you decrease negative feelings such as anxiety and depression. Well, that's good if it's a passing problem, if it can be a temporary blip in your emotional state. We solve the problem, you feel better, we move on. That isn't climate change. Climate change is persistent and it's complex. So it's not a bad technique, It's just not exactly the best problem-solving approach you can think of. There's just a plain old problem-solving approach. This is science. You present the facts, you search for concrete solutions, you implement the solutions. Problem, identify the problem, solve the problem, follow up, problem done. Again, this does not fit well with climate change. There's how many, let's sit here for the next 50 minutes and talk about all the problems associated with climate change, and then the next 50 minutes about how those all interact. And so it's just too complicated for this. So the one that I advocate it's called meaning-focused problem solving. And we'll talk about that in some detail here. So one thing is that meaning-focused problem solving takes into account your values. This is particularly good for a persistent problem because your values are enduring, right? Your problem-solving approach to a certain thing might just be a situational thing. You might get over an emotional situation, but your values of responsibility, integrity, love of nature are enduring. They will be with you forever. And so that's good. You always anchor it in your values. Meaning-focused problem solving is honest, but it tries to balance negative with positive. If you see if you think about my little story about the list, I mean, that was my meaning-focused problem solving. That was sort of like, let's do a ledger. What's the positive and the negative? And you always try to find that positive meaning, because whereas fear is a useful signal and motivator, too much gloom and doom leads to paralysis. So we know that if we do animal research, I used to help a professor. If all you do is punish something, any organism, eventually it just shuts down. It just stops in its tracks, because no matter what you do, you go left, you get shocked, you go right, you get shocked, it doesn't matter. You just stop. And so I think it's very hard, it's difficult, it's time consuming, it's all those things to look for those nuggets of of hope in the climate change crisis, but it's absolutely essential. And when we talk about talking about climate change with kids, that's one of the jobs that adults have, is to look for those positive signs. Now this is not putting on rose-colored glasses. This is not the opposite of denialism or another form of denialism. Saying, oh, everything will be, people say there's nothing wrong is one form of denialism. I think the other form is everything will be okay. Don't worry about it. That's another, to my thinking, that's just another form. And it doesn't, the kids no good to indulge in denial with them. But on the other hand, if you overwhelm them with fear and doom and gloom, that's not good either. So in the kind of the shorthand of this is, it's really hard to be a parent, isn't it? This is one of those parenting dilemmas, like how much is too much, how much is not enough. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so the other thing that meaning-focused problem solving does is you focus on positive engagement, on doing things, active engagement. That's part of the plan. Again, it takes that long-term view. It's a long-term plan and commitment. You acknowledge that this is an enduring thing that you're going to be working on. It's not a one-shot deal. Now, I want to end with this, is you can utilize those emotion-focused techniques or problem-solving techniques within this other larger context of meaning-focused work. They're very good techniques. And the other thing is, it's good for us as well. And it's a general approach to solving things and facing dilemmas that can be applied to other situations. So we talked about the two important developmental assets: problem-solving skills and communication skills. So let's talk about how to talk. That's how you problem solve with kids. How do you talk to kids? And number one, my advice to parents is often, the first thing is we worry about what our kids hear from us, but worry more about what they see. I mean, they're going to follow you. Being a role model is the best teacher. It's the best communicator. So this is the one. I have lots of scripture that I've collected in the years related to this, but this is the one I kept in for time's sake. But I just like it so much. It's from Titus. It just to me shows that nothing changes ever, nothing new under the sun. It says, show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, gravity, and sound speech. I mean, that's role modeling. I mean, that's the Old Testament view of role modeling. It's the best description or definition I think I've seen. Now, the other thing we know is that kids take their cue from adults around them. So how you react to things is what they're going to learn. How you react, verbally and non-verbally. So if you react with anxiety, doom and gloom, anger, all those things are valid, by the way. Those are valid feelings, and showing your kids those feelings, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just the awareness of knowing that they're going to be watching you carefully. And the first thing I tell parents to do, if you want to communicate with your kids, I mean this politely, but just be quiet. Talk less, listen more. It's more important when you have a conversation with a kid to open up the avenues by asking questions, by showing intentional, active listening, by being curious, by being reflective, by showing that you appreciate what they have to say. Advice is not a very good, I learned as a psychologist, just giving advice is very ineffective, actually. It's better to listen to the kid, and that teaches them how to express themselves, and it shows that you respect what they think. And the other thing, getting back to the primary topic this morning, is you need to make talking about climate change a regular thing. It's not something you should talk about just about when it is in the newspaper, on the news. Oh, you have that section in science in school. It needs to be a regular discussion about this. And again, with highlighting maybe positive things. We'll get into having a family plan here in a minute. Now, not all kids, if you haven't noticed, kids aren't created equal in terms of their cognitive and communication abilities. So you need to talk with them in age-appropriate ways. And how do you do that? Number one, be very careful about using technical terms. And what I would, keep it clear, keep it concise, and avoid jargon. And the example I would be, if you want to challenge yourself, think about how in a few words you would explain to a kid how a bicycle works. And I'm a bike guy, so I could go on about sealed bottom brackets and threadless head tubes, and the kid would be like, know nothing about how a bike works after they talk to me. I mean, they wouldn't, because I'd be assuming they know all, everybody knows what a threadless head tube, it's common knowledge. No, it's not. And so think about things like that. Like, how would you explain to your kid, how does a bicycle work? And that's how you talk about any subject, but especially climate change. For younger kids, stories and pictures, I've got some resources at the end. There's some books that are quite good. Stories and pictures for younger kids, and a metaphor, the one that it's hard to come up with one, frankly, but the one that I like the most is Catherine Hale's, which is, if kids can understand that if it's a hot day and I put a blanket on you, how do you feel? I start feeling pretty bad. What if I put another blanket on you on a hot day? They can kind of get that. And that's just an example of they can understand the warming effects of climate change. Now, a lot of kids aren't verbal learners, they're visual learners. So being aware of your own kids or the kids you're working with, their learning style is very important. And my own experience, this hasn't really been played out in research, is that boys tend to be more visual and active learners And so that's very important, to talk less and do more with those kids. My daughter, she's gonna hate me. I'm going on a hike with her, but I'm gonna tell a story about her. She didn't like sports. And I joked with her when we finally said, what you really need is a book club that reads books about sports. I mean, she was a reader. She was an analytical, verbal, that's how she learned. She liked that. She wasn't necessarily a doer, but a lot of kids are doers, so they need less talk and more action. And then the other thing to remember is that the working memory, the amount of information that little kids can remember, is quite small, actually. It grows as you get older. And so I used to train staff at Northwoods, and I'd say, if you're working with a 9-year-old, you have 7 words to get your point across, because this kid can remember 7 words. If your message is in words 10, 11, and 12, if he doesn't get it, it's not his problem. It's yours. You spent too much time giving context or whatever you want to think about it, instead of, you need to be very concise. And I just made that rule up, but it works, it seems like. 7 words, if you can discipline yourself. How am I going to say this in 7 words to this kid that gets the meaning across? Later, you can talk forever if you get the kid's interest, but your primary message. And then the other thing I'd say is, before, I always put a sort of disclaimer on this presentation, that it's kind of PG, it's parental guidance. Because you have to be careful what you present with kids. If last week wasn't an example of that, I mean, how much do you show kids about what's been happening in Israel? I mean, if you have an 18-year-old who's very into international affairs and very savvy and very mature, you might talk to them, show them certain things. But if you have little kids, you have to be careful about how they interpret that, because you need to think with them in age-appropriate ways. Reasoning develops over time, and the key transitions occur from 7 to 11. So if you tell a kid that the sea levels are rising, and they're going to look out at Lake Superior, and they're going to see an endless expanse of water, and you taught them what is the sea but a big expanse of water, it wouldn't surprise me if they come to the conclusion that Lake Superior is going to rise. So they're very concrete. Younger kids are concrete thinkers, and then you need to learn to tell fantasy from reality. And as they develop this capacity to think abstractly and hypothetically. And finally, this perspective taking. Little kids don't have that ability yet to take the perspective of others. They're self-centric, as it should be. Now, let's talk about, for the last 5 minutes here, just what can families do? Now, one of my most important, it's experiential. And what this means is that no action is trivial. Anything a kid does, I'm not saying they get a trophy for everything. It gets acknowledged because it's action, it's engagement. So even if they do pick up a gum wrapper, that's important. It's important to acknowledge it. Again, you don't want to go overboard. So you celebrate, you set up, I think you need to set up a celebration. Sit down. One of the conversations you can have is to say, we're all in this together. Trying to develop a family plan, maybe an energy audit, and talk about that. Involve the kids. You say, okay, we've got this energy audit. We want to shrink our carbon footprint. There's a long list. I'm not going to go through the list. Just Google it on internet. What can families do? I'll provide some examples, but here are some, like switching to LEDs, turning down the thermostat, having that audit, switching to alternatives. And this is suitable for the refrigerator door. Refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And you can do all of those things. And I say post, if you want to, you can post this plan on the refrigerator door to show that it's important. And it gets the kids involved. Here's just some examples. Eat green and locally, ride a bike, yes, walk or take the bus instead of drive. This is very important. Get outside and experience nature. Consider forming a creation care team at your congregation. And join and support civic groups addressing climate change, in particular the Citizens Climate Lobby. Not just kidding. There's lots of really good groups out there. And so I'll conclude there and take some questions. I think we have some time. Good. We have 10 minutes. I wanted to leave 10 minutes. That's right, 10 minutes?
Yeah,
okay. And
yeah,
I just wanted, so here are some resources. I'll just point out a few that are good for kids. Global weirding it's a little bit dated, but it's little 4 or 5 minute videos by Catherine Hayhoe. And like one of them is entitled, "I'm Just a Kid, What Can I Do?" I mean, and they're animated and they're really kind of fun and they're lighthearted. And I like those. Just Have a Think for adults is a climate solutions channel on YouTube, which I think is really good. National Geographic Kids, NSA, NASA, Climate Kids. Another book, and then the most fun book I've read on climate change ever is this book called Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, which is about how to communicate with people. It's by John Cook, who is an expert in communication with climate science. It's hilarious. It's about conversations with his cranky uncle at dinner. And you can imagine a cranky uncle's approach to climate. So it goes through all the different arguments. So what do we want to talk about?
I'm going to pass this book around.
Oh yeah, Yeah.
This is aimed at like 8 to 12.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, if somebody wants to borrow it, I'll put my name in it.
Yeah, and I have his permission now to put to use pictures and vignettes and things out of that book in this presentation. I just haven't.
There's lots of things.
Oh yeah, it's a really good book. His other book, Paul Douglas again, The Evangelical's Guide to Climate Change in the Healthy Environment or something along those lines. Yeah, he's a meteorologist, and that's a worthwhile book to read. Anything by Catherine Hayhoe is worth looking at. So what else? What other
questions? Feel free to raise your hand. I can move the mic around. Yeah, go for it, Tom.
Not so much a question as a comment. It's, we hear these talks. That's what we do in forums, and really appreciate them. Thank you for coming, Charlie. But I think we have a hope we can put out there. We have a history we can put out there. We've been messing up the planet. We've also been reversing that. And we need to remember those times we've taken big problems and reversed them.
Yes.
When I was a kid, I remember smog in Los Angeles where I grew up. And I remember getting worse. And then they did some things, banned incinerators, backyards in the whole valley that were burning on Tuesdays. And you couldn't breathe. And then that cleared it up. And then Eisenhower, in my time, started building freeways. Well, that brought some smog on, and you couldn't see the mountains. And then they went to, I think, like 3 different levels of smog devices over the years, and each time it got better. I think right now it's better than it was when I was a kid out there, as far as smog. And they went from 2-lane freeways to 6 lanes each direction, and more of them. And it's better. My wife can remember the Detroit River on fire. That's
the Cuyahoga River, the famous Randy Newman song.
Okay, and then I remember when I was a kid, the Lake Erie was dead.
Yeah.
Now it's not. We reversed that. The ozone layer is better now. We've changed chemicals, and we have to remember we've done these big things. It takes a while to reverse, but it's not hopeless.
Well, the title of Paul Douglas' book is "It's Not Hopeless, We're Not Helpless."
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree.
Silent Spring.
Yeah.
You know, and I bet other people can, I think we ought to make a list of this stuff and just say, this is not something we can't fix.
And if you look for it, well, and you're absolutely right. Two things. If you look for it, you'll find it in the newspaper. That, you know, my basic message to kids are there's a lot of really smart people working on this. And these are the same kind of smart people that solve these other problems. And the other thing I like to highlight are things that you look in Paul's book, he does vignettes about kids that are doing things. And I like to highlight those as well. So it's things that our adults are doing, but also things that kids are doing. You know, but you're right. And you got to look for it. And do your little ledger on your legal pad. What positive things have I looked for? Again, it's a complex problem. And people would say, well, this isn't going to fix, you know, there's all these arguments. But from a kid's point of view, that's not my point. My point is that people are working on this. You know, and that, you know, this isn't that one particular strategy isn't going to solve it.
I'd like to second that. When I was in elementary school, they taught me about the ozone.
Yeah.
And showed how it was being destroyed. And then turned off the video and said, this chain reaction goes forever.
Yeah.
And we're screwed. And it wasn't true. I mean, that piece that we weren't totally screwed and we did fix it. And so I do think that your point is very well taken. Is that showing that solutions are out there, even though we haven't solved them yet.
And pairing that up with doing something and the kid doing something and being acknowledged for doing something. That's why I say no action is trivial. I mean, because there's no one action that's going to solve this. It's going to be a lot of trivial things that are going to solve this. And so there's no reason that kids can't get in the game and feel the same thing. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you saw this, but a while ago in the Minneapolis Star Trip, there was an article about New Jersey integrating climate studies all the way through K-12. But the thing that made me laugh is they're talking about like kindergarten first graders about what's happening to penguins in Antarctica. You know, so it's all based on problem solving. And so they talk like one kid said, well, one penguin can live in my freezer.
Good idea, actually.
No, you can have a boat. Anyway, what it was doing was stimulating that sense that we all have ideas that work. And I think it's like a great curriculum. I haven't gone into it, but. And
Will Steger's organization, if any teachers here, Climate Generations, thank you for saving me. They develop curriculum for different age groups for teaching about climate change. I'll be around. I'll hang out.
Charlie's going to be around. We have time for one last question. Anyone? Leave it to the group. All right. Well, we'll end formally then. But before we do that, a reminder that next week we're going to have an AMA. That's an acronym for those of you that don't know for Ask Me Anything with Reverend Jill or with Jill. And at this point, obviously, Charlie will be around for any other ongoing questions. And thank you all so much for being here this morning. We really appreciate you joining us.